Thank you very much. A few thank yous to start off with. First of all, thank you, Greg. As Pat said, without Greg, we all wouldn't be here. So thank you for who you are and for what you do. And thank you very much for inviting me to be with you today. I then want to thank Karen because the direct invite came from Karen. I've known Karen since the South Africa conference that was put together for Professor Tim Noakes. And she is quite simply amazing. I think everybody would agree with that. And I'd also like to thank Brad and Tian. Their logistics in getting us here and getting us ready were quite superb. So thank you to all of those people especially. All right, so I want to talk about the money versus the evidence in the context of the mess. And you've seen this great graphic outside this room. If any of you haven't heard me speak before, I tend not to clutter up my slides with references, but there are a lot of references. So if you want to go to my site, /CF for CrossFit 19, all the references are on there, and I recommend the very first reference highly, because it's an article called The Mess, written by Greg, and to sum up the mess, it's basically the escalating disease, the escalating medical costs, which many people are profiting from, but none are combating effectively. And that sums up what the mess is all about. So imagine you're a multi-million-dollar food company. Advice that supports your products would obviously be very helpful. Public health advisors who promote your products would be very helpful too. And those public health advisors having a monopoly on promoting your products. Now that would be super really helpful. But that is exactly what is going on in the US. Now, when I wrote my obesity book, it was back in 2010. It's one of the books out in reception. There's passages I look at and I think I would really love to update those, especially the dietary fat stuff. And there's passages I'm pleased that I was writing about 10 years ago. And in the conflicts of interest chapter, I looked at the sponsors that were partnered with the American Dietetic Association, as it was known then. And those were some of the household names. Now, behind those organizations, at the time I was doing this research 10 years ago, $467 billion behind the American Dietetic Association. Now, wind forward to today, they now call themselves the Academy, how arrogant is that, of Nutrition and Dietetics. They have a different set of sponsors, and they only now have about $100 billion in backing. Now, if you go to the most recent dietetic report for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, their revenue amounts to $2.8 million. So they are doing a shed load of stuff on very, very little money. And I suspect because it's got this kind of backing behind that organization. Now, where does the monopoly come in? Well, there was an organization called the Commission on Dietetic Registration that was set up in 1969. And as of this month, 104,000 dietitians and nutritionists are registered with this organization. And there are legislative bills in almost all the states in the US. So where you've got the red states, those have the full Monty of protection for the dietitians and the nutritionists who are giving out, in essence, the fake food company advice. And so there are 27 of those and the District of Columbia. You've then got 17 in green. They're the next level down. They've got a protected title situation, but it has the same effect. If you're not a registered nutritionist or a registered dietitian, according to their advice, you can't practice in those states. You've got 3 in the yellow that have a degree of protection, but you'll still find it difficult to have a carte blanche advice consultation operation in those 3 states. And then let's hear it for the 3 rebels, because you've got Michigan, Arizona, and New Jersey, beautifully positioned there in white, who've said so far, and they've held out, we're just not having this. And you can see the organization behind that on these slides. But it creates a conflict because we've basically got the law, because on the left-hand side, you've got a very typical extract from those acts that operate in those states. This one just happens to be from Illinois, but it's basically saying if you're trying to practice without being licensed under this act, then you're committing, I think it's a class 1 misdemeanor in most states. You can be prosecuted, you can be fined. I don't think they go as far as throwing you in jail, but for every time you offend, you can be fined. So if you ignore the ban and offend again, you get fined again. But that clashes right up with your fabulous First Amendment, because your First Amendment, which is not shared by other countries in the world, we're fighting for free speech at the moment. You've got a First Amendment that says you've got a right to say what you feel and what you believe. And where does that stack up? Well, before I even knew some of the things that were going on with CrossFit, I'd prepared this presentation when I was back in Wales, and there were a couple of cases that really, really caught my eye. I had no idea that CrossFit are actually involved in these cases. So this is a guy called Steve Cooksey, and Steve Cooksey was catastrophically ill. So he was chronically obese, he was a couch potato. These are his own words. He was really an unhealthy guy, and he was rushed to hospital, almost into a coma, and they said to him, you've got type 2 diabetes, and so therefore you're now going to be on insulin and drugs for the rest of your life, and you now need to eat a low-fat, high-carb diet. Now, Cooksey's quite a challenging kind of guy, so he said, this doesn't really make sense. I've got a condition whereby I can't handle glucose, and they're telling me effectively to eat glucose. So he did the opposite, and he lost 78 pounds, and he put his type 2 diabetes into remission, and he looks like he does now. But that's when he came across the legislative powers of the dietitians and the nutritionists, who are protected. So he started his blog sharing his own story because he wanted to inspire other people. You don't have to take this advice that you're being given. And his blog started in 2010, but it was when he started an advice column on his site, and it was called Dear Abby, just a fictitious person, send in your queries, I'll give you back my opinion. And that's when the dietitians kicked into touch. So by January 2012, he had notifications from the North Carolina Board of Dietetics and Nutrition that he was essentially practicing without a license. Now, in May 2012, this organization here, the Institute of Justice, helped him with his lawsuit, and CrossFit are helping both of them. So they took on the case on the basis of the First Amendment. And in June 2013, and if you look at the references for this slide 7, there is a fabulous judgment there, which is well worth a read, because some of the statements in that Fourth Circuit opinion are really interesting, how they talk about the law coming up against the First Amendment. And they actually come to the conclusion that they cannot allow Cooksey's appeal to go forward without actually saying that there is a direct clash. So the outcome of that case was a victory for Cooksey, the Institute of Justice, and I now know CrossFit, because 3 things came from that case. First of all, North Carolina Board needed to change their act because it was recognized it was breaching the First Amendment. The second key thing to come out from that case was that Cooksey was allowed to continue to give his free advice. And the third observation was that there is a problem, not just in North Carolina, but there's a problem globally across the states where we've got these acts rubbing up against the First Amendment. And online was the key word that they used. And I do wonder if there's a difference between online and perhaps one-to-one consultations. So the final statement that came from Cooksey's lawyer was that North Carolina can no more require him to be a state-registered dietitian than they can require his fictitious Dear Abby to become a state-licensed psychologist. So that's where that case ended. So right up to date, July this year, just a week ago, Heather Del Castello was an unlicensed health coach, according to this article. Well, yeah, she'd started her company in 2015 in California, which, if you remember, was one of those yellow states, so it's not quite as bad as the green or the red ones. She was offering a 6-month program where you'd have 13 home one-to-one consultations, but in 2017, she moved to Florida. And Florida was one of those red states. And Florida then issued her very, very quickly with a case saying you are unlicensed and you are practicing in effect as a dietitian. So enter again the Institute for Justice, and the July ruling that has just come out has actually supported the Florida Dietetics Board to say we don't think Heather should be allowed to practice ongoing as a nutritionist. And the Institute of Justice are arguing both on the First Amendment principle and also one that I think may have even more success, the monopolistic practice principle, because this is outright monopolistic practice. And when you realize the monopolistic practice is backed by the who's who of the fake food industry, it makes you realize this is even more outrageous. So the lawyers for Heather, this was their summary statement. They are going to be appealing. They're basically saying for decades, since 1969, when this credentialing agency was formed, it has been knocking up against the First Amendment, and they've been breaking that amendment in the view of the lawyers. So this case is not finished yet. Now, for practitioners out there, and I came to realize this for my involvement in the Professor Tim Noakes case, because, of course, we had that crazy situation, was a tweet and advice. Are you actually in a consultation if you're on Twitter? Of course you're not. But I think the really safe areas for any practitioners are in giving out information and in giving opinions. And if you don't call it advice, it's very difficult for somebody to say you're not allowed to give information and you're not allowed to give your opinion, particularly in this country with the amendment that you've got. So what is the advice that these guys are dishing out? Well, it's the absolute classic dietary guidelines for Americans, My Plate and food labels. So I'm just going to whiz through what they think we should be eating. So I'll start with food labels because it's probably going to be the quickest. But you go on their website, that's the kind of advice you get on a food label, how to read a food label, what to do if you see XYZ on a food label. This is what the policies should be on food labels. If you don't know what something is without reading the label, then don't put it in your mouth. What are you doing? So that's that one dealt with. Then we have My Plate. I must admit, when I saw My Plate come out, I thought, how can people be so nutritionally ignorant? So if my laser, I'm not sure it's working terribly well here, but if you can see the protein down on the right-hand side, what they're trying to do here is to say these are the food groups that we should be eating. Protein is not a food group. Protein is a macronutrient. How dull do you have to be to not know the difference between a food group and a macronutrient? So they've missed out all of these food groups, all the ones in bold. The reference on this slide is a blog that I wrote on what I think the food groups are, and I'm happy to debate them. I think there are 9. You can separate out nuts and seeds if you want. You can separate out beans and lentils for all I care. But I'm going with 9. So they didn't include meat, fish, eggs, legumes, nuts and seeds because, of course, they lump them all together in protein. And we'll come on to a great little graphic in a second which shows how dull they are because they don't know where the protein is. So clearly I haven't got a lot of time for My Plate because it's so nutritionally ignorant. And then in the dietary guidelines for Americans, essentially what they're saying is eat the usual stuff, veg, fruit, healthy whole grains, protein is back in there again, dairy, and of course vegetable oils. But don't eat saturated fat, salt, and sugar. So I want to go back to Food Nutrition 101, and I hope there's probably some doctors, nutritionists, whatever in the audience. I hope there's still something to take away for each of you, because when you study nutrition, rather than being taught nutrition, and there is a very, very important difference, because if you're taught nutrition, you're taught the usual nonsense. If you study it, you can work it out for yourself. So go back to the basics of what food is. Why do we need to eat? Because we seem to have forgotten why we're eating. Food is mostly water. And then, of course, food is macronutrients. And we have 3 macronutrients. And from protein, we have essential amino acids, we have essential fats that we need to consume, but there is no essential carbohydrate. This is one of my favorite quotes in the literature. It's from the 2005 panel on macronutrients, an American government document. Provided you eat enough fat and protein, the lower limit of carbohydrate is 0. There is no essential carbohydrate. But there are essential proteins and there are essential fats. And obviously in nutrition, essential means something that we must consume. I mean, cholesterol is essential for life, but we don't need to consume it, we make it. So those are the macronutrients, and we then have micronutrients, things that we need in smaller quantities, and they are 13 vitamins, 8 of the B water vitamins, vitamin C, which is another water-soluble vitamin, and then the 4 fat-soluble vitamins, and then approximately 15, 16. We could have some debate on the minerals, but everybody knows zinc, calcium, copper, magnesium, iron, and so on. Those are the things that we need in our diet. So this graphic that I've put together, I really still can't see if this is working, but over on this side, what we're doing is looking at the 3 macronutrients. So over on the left-hand side, you've got pure carbohydrate. There is only one pure carbohydrate on the planet, and it is sucrose. 100% carbohydrate, arguably not a food because it brings no nutritional value whatsoever. And the definition of food is pretty much something that provides nutrition in some form. Over the other extreme, you've got pure fats, which would obviously be olive oil, coconut oil. Lard is a pure fat. Butter isn't. Butter does have some water and some protein. And And then you can see with the yellow bar over the top, protein is in absolutely everything else. It's in lettuce, it's in fruit, it's in legumes and steak and all the stuff that you would expect. Now, what I think is really interesting about real food is that nature tends to provide us with either carb proteins or fat proteins. Now, think of carb proteins as things that come from the trees and the ground. They're the things that vegans do eat. Think of the fat proteins as things that vegans don't eat. They're the animals. That's your meat, fish, eggs, and dairy. And then there's some really interesting foods in the middle, because nature really rarely puts carb, fat, and protein in good measure in the same foods. And the exceptions are things like nuts, seeds, and avocado. And it's probably why, because I work more with people trying to lose weight than I do with super fit people, I'm more reticent about nuts than CrossFit is, because they're what I call moreish. So if I'm working with overweight people, if I let people go into that fat-carb combo section, open a bag of cashews or macadamias, you just can't stop eating the damn packet. And the fake food companies have worked that out, because that's where all their food is. So think about muffins or ice cream or McDonald's and the bun or the hot dog and the bun and the ketchup. Everything in the fake food world is that fat-carb combo, which we humans cannot resist. We have no appetite restriction when it comes to that area. Now, the other interesting thing is, if you're going back to those essential proteins and those essential fats, they're found in the animal foods. Sure, you've got protein in lettuce and apples and legumes and all the rest of it, but it's not complete protein. Complete protein comes in animal foods. The essential fats, particular omega-3, comes in the form that the body needs it, which is EPA and DHA, in animal foods. Yes, flax seeds have got ALA, that's not the form in which the body wants omega-3. So that's my favorite chart on what food is all about. If we whiz through Carbohydrates 101, we start off with monosaccharides, which we know as glucose, fructose, and galactose. And let's call them what they are straight away, because monosaccharide just means a single sugar. And I think every time we think about carbohydrates, we've got to remember that we're talking about sugar. So we then have disaccharides, or two sugars. And you can see how sucrose is just a molecule of glucose and a molecule of fructose. And then maltose, which is not one we hear about so often, is two molecules of glucose. So you can immediately see, because of the blue, that every time you put something in your mouth that's a carbohydrate, you're putting glucose into the bloodstream. So why would carbohydrates be good for diabetes? Then we have polysaccharides, which are many sugars, and we have the digestible form. So in plants, that comes in the form of starch, and in humans, it comes in the form of glycogen. And of course, we're told to eat starchy foods so that we can replenish our glycogen storage room. And of course, if we've got full glycogen stores, we're never going to be losing weight, because the body's got the ready supply of fuel that it can tap into anytime it needs it. And then you've got the many sugars of the indigestible kind. So we have soluble, indigestible carbohydrates. That's things like beans and oats. We have insoluble carbohydrates, which are things like bran and whole grains. And of course, collectively, that is what we call fiber. So when people say that fiber is essential, fiber clearly isn't essential, because we already know that carbohydrates are not essential, and fiber is a subset of carbohydrates, so fiber is not essential. And plus, anything that ends up down the toilet, how good can it really be for you? Fats 101. There are 3 fats. We know them as saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. And I'd love to call them stable fats, mono-unstable fats, and polyunstable fats, because that is what we should be calling them, because the saturated fat is the most stable. When you've got the carbon atoms in the middle, you've got the hydrogen atoms on either side of the carbon. You can see it from the top picture over there, and it's just forming a perfect stable chain, which is why it will be solid at room temperature. So you then move to something that's more heavily monounsaturated fat, and it will be liquid at room temperature, and it might well go solid in the fridge. And then the polyunsaturated fats, where you've got more than one area where the hydrogen atoms are missing, and that will be liquid at fridge temperature. Now, a couple of fascinating facts about fat. Every single food that contains fat contains all 3 fats. There are no exceptions. And one of the things I've come to realize since discovering that is you will struggle to find a food that doesn't contain at least a trace of fat. In fact, it may only be sucrose that one over on the left-hand side. If you find a nutrition label on the next packet of blueberries you buy, there may well be a trace of fat, which means there's all 3 fats in the blueberries. And the second interesting factoid about fat is only dairy products have more saturated than unsaturated fat. Not that saturated fat is bad and unsaturated fat is good, but just to set the record straight. So you will now be able to answer this question, and don't worry, I won't pick on any, but which of these foods has more saturated than unsaturated fat? It is the low-fat milk, because it's only dairy that has more saturated than unsaturated fat. So what you've got on this slide, and we've got some postcards. I've got some on a website. They're not with us, but I've got a website with this picture on there, and we can always get some cards sent over to Greg if some of you want to hand these out, because these are just great to have in your handbag, to have a bit of a laugh with people. Because what we've got on this slide is the first number is the total fat in that item. So you've got steak, you've got eggs, you've got an oily fish, mackerel, lard, I love the lard one, almonds, olive oil, and of course that low-fat milk. First number is the total fat out of 100 grams, so it's immediately also a percentage. The second number is the saturated fat content of each of those products. So come down to the lard. Lard is mostly monounsaturated fat. Eggs are mostly monounsaturated fat. Steak, ditto. So then our superpowers that be will tell us to eat oily fish, but they'll tell us not to eat red meat in the name of fat. Well, oily fish has got twice the total fat and 1.5 times the saturated fat of the red meat steak that I pulled out of the USDA database. So how does that work? And then look at olive oil, which is supposed to be the elixir of the Mediterranean diet. Well, we've got 14 times the total fat in olive oil and 7 times the saturated fat. And then people say, yes, but you wouldn't have 100 grams of olive oil, you might have 100 grams of steak. Okay, but 1 tablespoon of olive oil has got more saturated fat than a 100-gram pork chop. So how crazy is our diet advice when you start looking into nutrition? And just while we're sticking with steak, because I know we love our steak, and we've been very generously given a lot of steak since we arrived on Sunday, they say some really, really, really dull things about steak. So the 2 dullest things that they say about steak is, 1, it's going to clog your arteries. Now, I think there's probably only one way in which that could happen, and that would be if you intravenously injected it. Other than that, I can't work out a mechanism. And then the second thing that they say is it's full of saturated fat. Well, it isn't. The first thing it's full of is water. Before you cook it, almost all food is, the main ingredient is water. Vegetables, of course, are up at about 90%. Then it's full of protein, complete protein that's going to make us healthy and strong. Then you've got a little bit of ash and minerals. Then you've got the fat, which, remember from the previous slide, amounts to 7%. And of that, just a couple of the percent are saturated fat. So saturated fat literally is the last thing that steak is. And yet they're running around telling us not to eat red meat in the name of saturated fat. So we're now going to look at the evidence, because we looked at what they're telling us to eat, and we've looked at Nutrition 101, so we know what's going on with food and carbohydrates and fat. So if we want to look at the evidence for what they're telling us to eat and then the evidence for what we think that we should be eating, then let's have a look at this. Now, this is commonly viewed as the evidence pyramid. So right down at the bottom, you've got test tube research, you might have animal research. Moving up the pyramid, you get to things like case reports or opinion pieces. You've got to be coming in at the top of the pyramid to be having some seriously credible evidence. And over recent years, and this is debatable, it is generally seen that a systematic review, when you go through all the literature and look at all the studies, you don't cherry pick, and then pooling those together in something that we call meta-analysis, that's generally regarded to be the top of the evidence tree. And if you can pool together randomized controlled trials where there was actually an intervention, so you can establish causation, that's supposed to be the top of the tree. They will then try to pull together things that we call epidemiological studies, and we'll come on to those in a minute because they are nowhere near as good. So we're trying to get stuff up at the top of that evidence pyramid. And so I'll start off with the meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, evidence for the dietary guidelines for Americans, and the Academy for Nutrition and Dietetics. And I didn't forget to put anything on that slide because that is the meta-analysis evidence of randomized controlled trials for their diets. There is none. There is arguably only one RCT that is large enough and long enough that has actually tested this diet, which is rich in veg and fruit and grains, protein, of course, in everything, dairy, oils, etc. And it was, of course, the Women's Health Initiative, which was the main paper was published in 2006, and those were the key findings. So you've got large enough and long enough. You've got nearly 49,000 women over 8 years. The intervention was to have more vegetables, more fruit, more grains, less fat, and it made no difference whatsoever. Now, some really interesting things that we need to note before we move on from this. Women's Health Initiative. So immediately every man in the room can ignore it. It was conducted on postmenopausal women. I haven't seen a woman in the audience yet who looks over 30, so it also doesn't apply to any of you. It's a very, very select group. It's what we call non-generalizable. You can't then apply it to the general population, even if they had found something. And the next thing that is so important, because we're trying to talk about evidence base here, remember that the first dietary guidelines for Americans came in 1980, and in 1977, they were being put together by Senator McGovern. So back in 1977, we had the fruit, veg, whole grains, low-fat, high-carb advice coming in. The women were recruited, they were enrolled into this study between 1993 and 1998. That's 20 years after the advice has already been given. So we can categorically say it is not evidence-based, because for something to be evidence-based, the evidence must come first. And it never can be evidence-based because the evidence wasn't there first. So what I'm hearing now is at a conference in London in May, and there was a Cambridge academic, and they're starting to talk about evidence-informed because they know they're never going to win the evidence base because it wasn't there at the time. So then we turn to the epidemiological evidence, and there are three fundamental flaws with epidemiology, and I'm going to be glancing at Gary quite a lot here because Gary hates epidemiology more than possibly anyone else in the world, quite rightly. The first flaw, obviously, with epidemiology is that it can only ever establish association and not causation. So what I've got here is some data or some studies from the fiber whole grains world. So this one came out in January of this year by Reynolds, and they were claiming that there would be a 15% difference in all-cause mortality if you've got people having 30 grams of fiber a day versus 5 grams of fiber a day. I mean, seriously, how bad does your diet have to be that you're not even having 5 grams of fiber a day? You're not even having a vegetable or a nut, from what I can work out. So anyway, they established the association. They then look at relative, not absolute risk. So that 15% number is relative, not absolute risk. Now, with a meta-analysis, you don't have the detail of the studies in that top-level paper. So to understand what's going on with absolute risk, you have to go down a level. So I went to Yang, which was one of the most important papers in an umbrella review that had been done on fiber at the time. And Yang very helpfully came up with a 16% difference in all-cause mortality. So I know that I'm looking in roughly the right area. And the absolute risk in this case was 0.68% over the duration of the study. So when you apply that 16% difference, it comes down to the difference between 0.63 and 0.73. So that's a difference of between 6 in 1,000 and 7 in 1,000. And that's if it were causal, and it isn't, because you don't get into causation unless that top number is 100%. You've got to have something like double the association before Bradford Hill criteria would kick in. So who cares? Even if it were causal, you're going to go out and eat 30 grams of beans just to avoid that kind of risk. And then possibly the most important aspect, the healthy person confounder. Because every time you look at epidemiology, there's a characteristics table. And you look at the people in the 30 grams a day of fiber, and you look at the people in the 5 grams a day of fiber. And I just picked out one study here to give you the exact figures. So this is the Zoo study, which was key in that Reynolds paper. Twice the alcohol intake for the lower fiber guys, 1.5 times as likely to be obese, 1.5 times as likely to be in the lowest activity category, 1.5 times as likely to be in the lowest education. Every time you see an epidemiological study or a meta-analysis of all of those studies, those are the three things going on. And the healthy person confounder, I think, is one of the most important. Gary said in the Denver conference earlier on this year, what they're doing with epidemiology is they're taking that super healthy person who doesn't smoke and doesn't drink and is super active and well-educated and high income, and they just happen to eat in this way. And what they're saying is if everybody else ate in that way, they would be as healthy as that super healthy person. which of course is madness because they've got every other advantage on top of that going on. So that then drives you, and you can insert any word you like for the word fiber. So when you spot that healthy person, when you see that epidemiological study, is the thing that they're talking about a marker of the fact that the person is healthy, or is it what makes them healthy? I think somebody who eats whole grains and beans and pulses is a healthy type of person. I don't think giving those beans and pulses to another person is going to make them healthy. Make a marker is a really important thing. So it got me thinking, let's explore this healthy person just a little bit more. Why do they even find a 15% difference, even though it's relative risk? Why do they find a difference? So I came up with this 2x2 matrix, because at the same time they were trying to say, you've got to eat your healthy whole grains because you've got to be having loads of fiber. So I split the food groups. There's 9 food groups from earlier on, and I put them into this thing that I've called the carb fiber matrix. Up in box A, you've got a lot of the stuff that we eat. So it's high fiber, but low in carbohydrate. And then in box C, you've got stuff that's low carbohydrate, low fiber. Over in box B is where they want us to be living. So it's high fiber, high carbohydrate. And then I think we've got agreement. If we could get the conflict of the fake food companies out of the way, we should please have agreement that we shouldn't be occupying box D, which is low fiber, high carbohydrate, just pure junk. So what kind of person is occupying box B? Well, because we're in America, I think it's the kind of Gwyneth Paltrow kind of person. Now, Gwyneth Paltrow loves fruit and vegetables so much, she actually named her children apples and muesli. No, I jest. She actually named her children Apple and Moses, but it's pretty close, don't you think? So she's up there. Now, she's healthy. If she eats legumes, it's not going to make a difference to her health. And then down in box D, and remember, when they're doing these fiber studies, they're not comparing box B with box C or with box A. They're comparing that dreadful, dreadful diet down in box D. And love him or hate him, you've got to admit he doesn't eat well. But that's what you're comparing. So that's your healthy person confounder. Think Donald and think Gwyneth, and you'll be just about there. So the latest meat bashing that we had, this was only 6 weeks ago or so, so another study came out. This one was from the UK, makes it slightly different. A rasher of bacon a day and you're all going to die. It came from this article in the Journal of Epidemiology. And I'm far more interested in non-significant findings than I am in significant findings, because non-significant findings tell you a lot. So in this study, there were a shed load of non-significant findings, but they didn't report them. They just reported the one where they found something for a rasher of bacon. We'll come on to that in just a second. So the non-significant findings they found were for bowel cancer and poultry and for fish and for dairy, interestingly. If you ever want a study to say that dairy is not going to be a problem for bowel cancer, believe it or not, this vegan study is going to help you out. Cheese and even bowel cancer and red meat, because of course the headline was about red meat, but as soon as you get into the detail of the paper, they drop the red meat bit and they're into red and processed meat. And then really interestingly, because we're told that all this fruit and veg and fiber, etc., is going to save us from bowel cancer, there was not an inverse association with all of those, or tea or coffee, and bowel cancer. So they found nothing protective among the things that they like to tell us to eat. So in their association, not causation, they were claiming there's a 19% difference if you have 25 grams of bacon a day, which is basically a rasher of bacon. This is what the absolute risk boiled down to. It boiled down to 8 cases in 10,000 people in 6 years, so 1 in 10,000 person years. And that got headlines around the world. That's epidemiology for you. And of course, the healthy person confounder was absolutely in full swing in this paper. The meat eaters, processed meat in the main, were much more likely to be older and smokers and drinkers with a higher BMI, higher body fat, higher non-steroidal anti-inflammatory users, which is not great for the bowel, and lower vegetable eaters. So they have everything stacked against them, and they don't even always adjust for all of those things. So that's epidemiology. So right, the things, that's what they say we should be eating. So I think we're in agreement that there is just no evidence for the fruit and veg and all the rest of it. And then this is what they say we shouldn't be eating. If you remember, it was sugar, fat, and salt. Now on sugar, we agree. We agreed that sugar is not great for people. But what they don't seem to realize is that when they're recommending carbohydrates, they're recommending sugar, because they don't seem to know that they are single sugars and double sugars and many sugars. So that level of ignorance as well astounds me. Salt, we disagree. Why on earth do they demonize salt? So they demonize salt on the basis that there is a relationship between salt and blood pressure, which in the short term there would be. If you went out now and had a salty bag of something, you would find yourself getting thirsty because that's your body's driver to take in potassium to balance out the sodium potassium and to get you back to normal. But if you're having a salty diet every day, I think it's an unnatural salty diet. So I think anything that they see with salt is actually more just a reflection of a processed food diet, because natural food is naturally balanced in sodium and potassium. But anyway, even if you care about the blood pressure angle, this is something that came from the 1994 COMA report. That's the Committee on Medical Aspects of Nutrition. It was a British report, and it was saying that the review group recommendation was to reduce salt consumption by 3 grams a day. That's practically halving the average salt consumption. And they said that that might affect systolic blood pressure, that's the first number you get in the blood pressure reading, by about 3.5 milligrams per hectoliter. And the final quote comes from one of Gary's books. He might even recognize it there, because Gary said exactly the same in The Diet Delusion, Good Calories, Bad Calories. Cutting our average intake of salt in half, which is really difficult to do in the real world, might get something like 4 to 5 drops in somebody with hypertension already, and perhaps only a couple in the rest of us. It makes no difference whatsoever. And they're not setting targets that we halve in salt. They're trying to say, oh, if we just got rid of it by 0.2 of a gram or something, it would make a big difference. Halve it is going to make bugger all difference. So stop demonizing salt. And if they had any evidence to link salt directly with any chronic condition, they would produce it, and they have none. The fact that they cannot produce that tells us that they have none. You will only ever hear them say that salt raises blood pressure, and blood pressure is associated with heart disease. And blood pressure is associated with heart disease, but is that because if you've got heart disease, your blood pressure goes up? So is it a marker or a maker? I don't think salt has got anything to do with it. Now, fat, we disagree. And we disagree, and this was the subject area of my Ph.D. So what I wanted to do for my Ph.D. was to go back in time to say, is this stuff evidence-based? Was the evidence there at the time that we introduced those 2 dietary fat guidelines to have no more than 30% of our diet in the form of total fat, no more than 10% of our diet in the form of saturated fat? So I did that evidence-based pyramid thing. I did the systematic reviews and the meta-analyses. I did them first of all with RCTs, then I did them with the epidemiological studies. And the unique thing about the PhD was that I went back to the time when the dietary guidelines were introduced. So the first 2 studies were done on the data that were available at the time to those dietary guideline committees. And there were only 6 studies. There were only 6 RCTs that would have been available to that committee. You'll know them as things like the Rose Corn Oil Trial, the Oslo Diet Heart Study, the Sydney Diet Heart Study. There were only 6, and none of them concluded that we should intervene in any way and make any dietary interventions. In fact, a couple of them warned about their interventions. So the Rose Corn Oil said that they were quite worried that it didn't appear to be beneficial and could indeed be harmful. And Woodhill warned about the toxicity, the potential toxicity of his intervention of a vegetable oil diet. And the Low-Fat Diet Committee, actually the final sentence of that paper from 1965 says, a low-fat diet has no place in the treatment of myocardial infarction, heart attack. And yet the committee went ahead and introduced those guidelines. So I'd also looked at the epidemiological evidence, the cohort evidence, and that would include things that you will have heard of, like the Framingham study, maybe the London Bank and Busmen study, and absolutely the 7-country study. You will all have heard of that. Only one of those 6 studies suggested that there was even a relationship between saturated fat and heart disease. Not many people know the 7-country study found nothing against total fat whatsoever. So there was absolutely no evidence underpinning the guidelines when they were introduced. So then you bring it forward and you say, okay, let's be generous. There wasn't evidence at the time. Is the evidence there now? The RCT evidence isn't there now. The epidemiological evidence isn't there now. And if you want to read one paper from all of my PhD, thank you BJSM for putting that on OpenView, it just wraps up all of those 4 studies and says where the evidence was, if there was any, and the overall evidence is resoundingly we should not have introduced those dietary guidelines, and those dietary guidelines on fat should not be there today. And I'm not alone in thinking this. And the final chapter of the Ph.D, you have to put your own research into context of what everybody else is doing. And many people have also been looking at this area. And you may well recognize some of these names. Skiaf and Miller were one of the first to kick it off back in 2009. You've got the very well-known Siri Torino paper. You've got the 2 Hooper papers, which are the Cochrane ones, Chowdhury 2014, Schwing-Shackle and Hoffman. And I only put in 4 of our papers, not the 8 findings that I could have put in. And that amounts to 40 separate findings. And a finding might be looking at saturated fat and heart disease, or saturated fat and cardiovascular disease, or it might be total fat and all-cause mortality. There were 40 different findings among those different teams of researchers. And the most important thing to notice on that combined slide, and that is the totality of the evidence where people also looked at mortality. That's really important because there's no point dying less of one thing to die more of something else. So those are the people who looked at mortality. 37 out of 40 found nothing. Why is that not the headline? Why is the newspaper headline not 37 independent findings from different teams of researchers came to nothing whatsoever? So what were those 3? Well, one was from Chowdhury, saying that trans fats seem to be bad for cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, whatever. No disagreement, I think, from anyone in the audience on that one. The other 2 then came from the Hooper study. And it should have been, again, important for Hooper to say, we found nothing. In fact, I'll bring up some of the things here, because this is where the Hooper study will come in. Nobody has found anything against total fat, ever, not even the Hooper study. And then Hooper will also report, as do all the others, there's nothing significant for all-cause mortality, or coronary heart disease mortality, or cardiovascular disease mortality, or fatal heart attacks, non-fatal heart attacks, stroke, coronary heart disease events. Nothing for all of those. They found one thing for cardiovascular disease events and swapping out saturated fat and swapping in polyunsaturated fat. So they said, we recommend that you do that. You eat less saturated fat, more polyunsaturated fat in the name of cardiovascular disease events. And they just repeated that finding 4 years later. And those are the only findings that we have against saturated fat. Now, when you look at the body of that massive paper, and I always credit Dr. Trudy Deakin for finding this, on about page 157 or something, they did a sensitivity test. And they said, let's look at the studies, not just where they set out to swap out saturated fat and swap in polyunsaturated fat, but where they actually achieved what they set out to do. And the finding falls away. So in the studies that actually did that swap, there's, again, nothing to report. And that's the totality of the evidence against saturated fat. So I'm sorry, dietitians, academy, whatever you want to call yourself, you can't keep standing up there and saying there's a problem with fat or a problem with salt, because the only problem is with sugar. So what do I think we should be eating? Well, if, again, we could get rid of the conflicts, could we perhaps agree that real food would be a good idea? Some people say, well, what's real food? Well, oranges grow on trees, cartons of orange juice don't, fish swim in the sea, breaded fish sticks don't. It's not tough. You can teach a 5-year-old. Twitter gets very excited when you start talking about real food. It's like, come on, guys, grow up. Choose that food for the nutrients it provides. Remember why we need to eat, because we need those complete proteins, essential fats, vitamins, and minerals. Eat a maximum of 3 times a day. Another piece of their advice is that we should eat little and often. We should graze. I have this little saying, unless you are a cow or want to be the size of one, stop grazing, because you will end up that way. Now, these are not the dietary-related ones, so I'll just flash these up. Manage alcohol intake to manage fat burning, because alcohol, the issue is not calories. You can't process the calories from alcohol. You cannot store them as fat. What's going with alcohol is it inhibits the operation of glucagon. So you cannot burn body fat while you're processing the alcohol. It can be helpful for diabetics, not to be abused, but it's not great for trying to lose weight. And then this was the phrase that I used in my 2010 obesity book. I hadn't heard of CrossFit then, but it's functional fitness. Do what we're designed to do. Lug things around, walk, clean, garden. If you've got a cleaner and a gardener, and then you're going down a conventional gym, they're getting a better workout than you are. That's crazy. So we're back to this. What should we be eating? Well, quite clearly, that's where we should be focused in terms of macronutrients, because we're going to get the complete protein and the essential fats in the form that we need them in those animal foods on the right-hand side. And I probably should have declared an interest earlier. I was a vegetarian for 20 years. I did not want to discover that. When I discovered that, it was not a good day. But you have to go with the evidence. And the evidence says you need to eat red meat and oily fish, and so you need to eat red meat and oily fish. So then if you look at the micronutrients, and what I've done on this slide is put up one of their 5 a day, that's a laugh as well, isn't it? An apple, brown rice, so you've got your healthy whole grains, you've got lentils, legumes, you've got a green vegetable, and then of course you put them up against what I know to be the healthiest food on the planet, which is liver, steak and sardines. So you've got a red meat and an oily fish. And then just put up some of the things that we need. The protein quality is a slightly subjective score. It comes from the USDA database. You've got, along the left-hand side here, you've got the recommended daily amount. I don't know how accurate they are, but it's a guide. And then you've got the winner in each row that I've put in red. So brown rice wins on calories. That's probably not the one you want to be winning on. And then just look at liver. I mean, liver then just cleans up on everything else. You need this is per 100 grams for all of them. You need so little liver just slipped into your diet every now and again to just get this fantastic nutrition. Sardines then, of course, start knocking it out of the park on the bone nutrients, vitamin D, and they will on the minerals, as we'll come to see. Broccoli does very well on vitamin C, but this is one of my other favorite nutrition factoids. Did you know that liver has almost 4 times the vitamin C of an apple? So, of course, you've got to be able to get the nutrients from animal foods because carbohydrates are not essential. Remember back a few minutes ago. So then we bring in the minerals and you keep the same foods. And because the plant foods come from the ground, they should start to do quite well for minerals. And I did get a little bit irked when I saw things like brown rice and lentils doing really well. So I thought, I'm just going to slip in a new food there because I'm a bit partial to very, very dark chocolate. So if you put in cocoa powder, which is, of course, the basis of 85% and above dark chocolate, then cocoa powder will be all of those healthy whole grains and legumes and fruits and vegetables. So jolly good for cocoa. So in summary, what do I think we should be eating? Number 1, real food. Choose that food for the nutrients it provides. I think Michael Pollan has famously said, eat food, mostly plants, not too much. And I've come to the conclusion we need to eat food, mostly animals, quite a lot. Because you do need something like a good 200-gram steak, sorry for you guys in ounces, that's like at least an 8-ounce steak, to be getting your zinc requirement for the day. Zinc doesn't just grow on trees, as I'm also fond of saying. So Michael will think we should be having the whole grains and pulses, and I think we should be having, ideally, I do understand not everyone can afford it or access it, but pasture-fed meat, eggs, dairy, fish, and berries. We agree on vegetables and salads, so we do have some agreement with the healthy whole food guys. And then I slipped in one new chart for this presentation. That might be worth a little camera photo, because I've put up at the top what they want us to eat, which is the veg, fruit, grains, dairy, of course, fat-free, and then I've put it against what we actually need as human beings. So we need the essential fats, we need complete protein. So the caveat is in the top left hand of the table, in the right form for the body. So I'm not scoring plants for vitamin A because they provide carotene, they don't provide retinol, and the body needs retinol. And when you get to the fat-soluble vitamins, the body wants D3, which comes from animals, not D2 that comes from plants. It wants K2 from animals, not K1 from plants. It wants heme iron. That's the most absorbable form. That also comes from animals. All the evidence points towards the fact, I'm sorry, but we need to be eating this stuff down at the bottom, the eggs, the dairy, the meat, and the fish. And of course, even meat will provide some vitamin C. So we have new areas of conflict going on in the world. We don't just have the Academy for Nutrition and Dietetics with their fabulous 100 billion worth of sponsorship behind them. You cannot have failed to spot the EAT Lancet report earlier on this year. And those are the organizations behind the EAT Lancet report. And I've just circled some of them. I think it actually would have been easier to circle the ones that either aren't agri-food biotech companies or just fake food companies. I think there might be, where there's Google in there, so I think Google is probably about the only good company. But if you like conspiracy theories, and Gary says he doesn't do conspiracy theories, I love conspiracy theories. The best conspiracy theory, and I don't think it's a conspiracy theory, is when you've got the agri-tech companies wanting to control our food supply, the EAT Lancet report is the way to do it. Because there is only one food on the planet that gives back to soil, and without soil we can't grow our own food, and that is ruminants. So that is cows and sheep and goats, and they chew the land and they give back to the land and they host the microflora and then regurgitate them and defecate and wee and whatever. It's just this fantastic cycle of life that maintains topsoil. Now go to a vegan world where you don't have those ruminants, you don't have the topsoil. Now these guys are already growing food upside down in greenhouses, no soil required. Now if you really wanted to control the world's food supply, which is surely the Armageddon end game of any fake food or agri-food company, we are going about it the right way. Damn red meat, promote the vegan agenda, get this kind of nonsense in the Lancet, call it in the name of climate change when actually you're doing the exact opposite. You're destroying the planet's ability to grow food. This is the final slide. The mess, which is where we started off, if you remember, is the combination of runaway medical costs and disease, which many profit from. And we've gone through a number of people who are profiting from those at the moment, from individual dietitians to huge agri-chemical companies, but none are combating effectively. The Academy, the dietary guidelines for Americans, that credentialing organization, they are at the heart of those who are profiting and yet are failing to combat. And their advice is not even evidence-informed, let alone evidence-based. So I think they need to be countered with an equal and opposite force. And I think these guys would probably make a great start. Thank you very much for listening.